This next series of conversations is going to be in regards to building on another key area of Western civilization. That is to take a look at and understand the civilization that's going to be coming out of what you know as the modern state of Israel, as well as Palestine. In regards to that, we're going to be looking at the peoples who settled there, their interactions, and more importantly, take a look at the emergence of a specific group of people who are labeled as the Hebrews, who later on in history will be called the Jews, and we'll get to that point. For now, let's take a look at some of the key elements that we're going to be looking at to understand them. One of them will be to take a look at their ancient scriptures, much like we use the Epic of Gilgamesh, or in Egyptian culture we look at the ideas of the hieroglyphs and the understanding of religious faith. Inside the story of the Hebrew peoples, we're going to be looking at their scriptures. And we're going to be looking at their scriptures in the sense that they are many things. For example, they are history. They're outlining things like genealogy. They're outlining the different factors involved in where their people were, what they lived, how they were doing, the key elements of their leadership, the developments of their religious ideas, and their interactions with others. But Scripture here is also going to be very telling because it's going to offer us some insight into their law code, into their concepts of how they want to use their space. There will be commentary about family structure, slavery, marriage, childhood, so that the Scriptures open up not just a conversation about detailed religious ideology and religious concepts and ideas and practices. In the process of doing that, it will also have other conversations about all the other factors in society and culture that are then displayed. For example, dietary laws and ideas about marriage, for example, and childhood. In the history that we're going to be looking at, remember, we're mixing together some of their written scriptural work, and they're also going to have to need to rely on some different things like archaeological evidence for tracking where people were through foundations of buildings, construction of temples and fortresses. We also get at information here by getting some of the concepts sort of proven by outside peoples. If we have a record of an outside people writing about going to war with the Hebrews, then that reinforces if we see that same story of that same war inside a Hebrew scripture, we now have a correlation that's going to help us solidify time and place and events. All right? So Scripture is going to supply us with lots of information, but remember, much like we looked at, say, the Epic of Gilgamesh, you have to take a look at the data, look at the information, look at the wording, and make sure that you interpret it, that you are not going to have to take it word for word, that there are times when you are dealing with a story that's open to interpretation. And that's always a difficult struggle for all historians and archaeologists to take a look at information and interpret it properly. Now, in the story that we want to lay out here for a second, we are going to start roughly around the year 1000, which is the edge of the age between the Bronze and the Iron Age that we laid out in our first lecture. This is a time frame where we're looking again at technology to help us understand how societies function, but it also means that we are able to kind of place it in a time and a place so that we know what we're dealing with in terms of the historical struggle. In this case, by about the year 1025 or so, Saul has been chosen as the military leader, as the king of his people in the hill country of what you know as modern-day Israel and Palestine today. He is the military leader who has been called upon to deal with outside external enemies around the Hebrew peoples, especially the Philistines. The Philistines are a large group that is identified as a key enemy of the people right now. Saul, though, fails. As a military leader, he fails. And in the context of his failure, he is then replaced by David. Now, David is the same one who we have the story in many people's cultures, especially the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. You have the story of David, the little boy who with a rock and a sling slays the mighty Philistine giant whose name was Goliath. That story lives on in many different cultural contexts, but this is the David who now is seen as the heroic leader of his people. Militarily and otherwise, he's the heroic leader. And what he does is he expands the territory that are controlled by the Hebrews and also solidifies their control over it. Now, as an historical record then, he is followed by Solomon. And Solomon is going to carry us through roughly the year 970, give or take, by our calendar. And he is going to then provide the end of this three kingship era of the aggressive expansion and consolidation of the Hebrew peoples, their military independence from their neighbors, their ability to assert their own cultural and religious ideas, and then especially with Solomon, Solomon's going to be the one who is said to be the foundation stone of Jerusalem, the key character who made Jerusalem happen as the center of Hebrew focus, both religious and then of course economic, and later on cultural as well. So that Jerusalem now is going to be more closely associated with the emerging Hebrew peoples who would now establish themselves as independent from those around him. Then in time, after Solomon dies, after about 970 BCE, what starts to happen is that the peoples are going to break. They're going to be two separate kingdoms, two separate states that used to be one. To the north, based in a city called Samaria, will be the kingdom of Israel. To the south will be the kingdom of Judah with its focus on Jerusalem. So as we're talking about those two states, we're talking about people who were Hebrew peoples who were united earlier and have now broken into two separate parts in the sense that politically they have divided against themselves essentially, and that they are now going to have a different tradition. Another concept for us to deal with is that there is a growing monotheism inside their belief systems. Here's the key. Even within the Hebrew scriptures themselves, if you go back into the first 5 scriptures that you'll probably see spoken of in your reading for this section, you'll see that the first 5 books of their scripture, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers and Deuteronomy, are the sort of ethos that laying out the cultural ideas, understanding of family life, food and dietary restrictions, also a sense of history. And inside of Leviticus, for example, there's that correlation with the Hammurabi's law code, that eye for an eye context, all right? So we have within this an attempt to go from a polytheistic to a monotheistic belief. And even within their book of Genesis, the Hebrews mention that when their leader Moses comes down from the mountain with the 10 Commandments, and we'll talk about that in a moment, the Hebrew people at this point, having just escaped from Egypt, are now worshiping a golden calf, another god, all right? So that the process of monotheism is not a done deal inside their own history, but is increasingly moving towards that. And one of the key elements in going from a polytheistic down to a monotheistic belief is why? How did it come to be that one god or goddess is going to emerge as the leader? What happened to the other one? How are they demoted? Those are difficult issues for us to look at one by one, but let's look at the grander concept of what was going to change. The Assyrians. When we mentioned earlier in one of the lectures about Mesopotamia, you saw that the Assyrians had been mentioned. In this context, the Assyrians, for the purposes of this talk, have now swept out of Mesopotamia and are moving along different trade routes and finding other opportunities to enslave people as well as expand their economic opportunities. This is the time period where many of the people who live in and around the area that is now being conquered by the Assyrians essentially tell stories of aggressive imperialism, military expansion, but also, for lack of a better term, absolute brutal terrorism. One of the strategies the Assyrians had as they're trying to conquer from city to city is they become very famous for their military technology and tactics. They are much better and much faster than many of the enemies they encounter, and they have, of course, specialized corps of Army Corps of engineers to help surround and destroy city walls, so that the military machine of the Syrians is very serious at this time frame. But they're also brutal. If you defy them, they will kill you. They use this idea that one way to make sure the next city obeys us before we get there is if the city now that we have surrounded defies us and we capture it, let us enslave and slaughter the population. There's lots of stories of this. So that the message to the next city and the city after that is quite clear. Resist us and we will obliterate you. All right? So one of the key factors in thinking about that is once the Assyrians do come into the picture and expand their range, they are going to encounter these two Hebrew kingdoms at Israel and Judah, and they are going to impose their will. When Israel, the northern kingdom, was created, it was with the 10 tribes of different peoples who associated in a clan network and were living in Israel. But by 722 BCE, the Assyrians have come in, obliterated, right, the area that was in and around the northern kingdom of Israel, enslaved and taken away those 10 tribes, and historically they disappear from the historical record. They seem to have been obliterated so much that those who did survive were dispersed because the Syrians and other Mesopotamians had a long history of dispersing their enemies, taking them hostage, and moving them to other places in the empire where they oftentimes lost their language and their culture and their religious affinity because it was a purposeful strategy to obliterate them. Now, that means that now that Israel is gone, that means Judah is going to maintain its independence. It does have to pay for the privilege of maintaining its independence, but it is not an open issue of remaining independent. As long as they do not attract the attention and as long as they continue to pay essentially protection money, if you want to think of it that way, as long as they continue to pay the Assyrians, they are left alone. This situation stays for a while, but in the meantime, within the Hebrew story, right, there is a significant amount of literature and expression where the prophets, these are religious and social and moral thinkers within the community of Hebrews, who are talking about, we as a people made a deal, right? The covenant had been the idea inside of Hebrew belief that said they had a special relationship with Yahweh, that Yahweh would always take care of them. As long as the people followed the laws, the Ten Commandments, and the other ideas that emerge within Hebrew belief. The prophets warn, if we fall, it will be because we stopped obeying the law, that we broke the covenant with Yahweh, and that in essence, by breaking that deal, we lost the protection of Yahweh, and our enemies now can come and take us at our mercy. That is the idea the prophets are talking about. They are telling the people of Judah, look what happened to Israel. Look what happened to that northern kingdom. And if you do not obey, if we do not follow the dictates of Yahweh, if we are not his true people, we too will fail. And in that context, in 586, Jerusalem is taken. The outside invader, in this case, a brutal king named Nebuchadnezzar II, comes in with his military forces, obliterates the last independent state that is controlled by the Hebrews, that was called the Kingdom of Judah, based at Jerusalem. The people are kidnapped and held hostage. And that's a classic thing that many different emperors and kings who had operated out of Mesopotamia, they had always seen people as an economic resource and would move them around their empire. So once again, here the same story had happened with the people of Israel is happening with the kingdom of Judah. They have been deported from their home in Jerusalem. Jerusalem has been taken, and now they're taken away. They're now held in hostage, in bondage, in slavery. All right? And this is the origin of the lament of Babylon. All right, to go back for a second. Remember Hammurabi, the ancient Mesopotamian king. He had lived and worked out of the city of Babylon in Mesopotamia. All right? The successors to many of those independent kingdoms had also been based in Babylon. And now, here is Nebuchadnezzar and his successors who are now taking people from Judah and are taking them in large numbers to be slaves in Babylon. This is the origin of many of the ideas that now people are, in their own words, by the rivers of Babylon, all right, wondering when they can go back home to Zion, when they can go back to Jerusalem. They're waiting for that day. They are maintaining as best they can their religious identity, their language identity. But like the first kingdom of Israel, that those people had essentially disappeared, the people who from Judah are now living in Babylon are there for a couple of generations, and they see this challenge of maintaining their faith and maintaining their opportunities in many ways to move forward. In this context, then, we are going to be taking a look at a people who are still emerging with their monotheism, are still emerging with their exact scriptures, and trying to find their moral code, their family code, their concept of economic justice that they had earlier practiced as an independent kingdom. Now they're simply trying to maintain it, try to maintain their identity as slaves in Babylon. And that's going to be a key challenge to these people, and they're going to need an opportunity to keep that faith and to keep it moving and maintain their cultural identity. Take a look inside of the chapter that supports this material. Make sure that you read carefully and get the larger context of what's happening in this time period. And also, do go back and take a look at some of the practice testing that will help look at whether you're getting this material.